My father died and left my older sister a $65 million corporate empire, a sprawling Hamptons mansion, and a fleet of luxury cars. He left me a small wooden box containing a single locked smartphone. My sister laughed in my face, calling me the defective child, while her husband, the company chief financial officer, smoothly slid the corporate ownership folders across the mahogany table. They thought they had won everything. They had no idea that the small piece of glass and metal in my hands held the digital keys to the very ground they stood on. My name is Nora. I am 34 years old, and I work as a data risk analyst. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, only to realize your worth was never determined by their validation. Growing up in a wealthy Chicago household, my existence was treated as a burden. The air inside Mr. Harrison's law office was thick with the scent of expensive leather and fake grief. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline stood gray and indifferent. I sat at the far end of the massive conference table, keeping a wide physical distance from my mother Caroline and my older sister Sienna. Sienna wore a custom black designer suit costing more than my apartment lease. Next to her sat her husband Terrence, an impeccably dressed African-American man who served as the chief financial officer of our family business Montgomery Holdings. Terrence checked his solid gold watch every few minutes, clearly impatient to get his hands on the inheritance. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, as he broke the red wax seal on my father Richard Montgomery's final will and testament. The tension was absolutely suffocating. I braced myself for the inevitable blow, because I was always the one left bleeding while they took the prize. Mr. Harrison began reading the dense legal jargon, but the bottom line was devastatingly clear. To my beloved daughter Sienna, I leave the entirety of Montgomery Holdings valued at $65 million, along with the Hamptons estate and the collection of vintage automobiles. Sienna let out a loud theatrical gasp, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. Terrence did not try to hide his victory. He leaned forward and smoothly pulled the thick stacks of corporate ownership folders toward his side of the table, his dark eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. My mother Caroline patted Sienna's arm, whispering about how proud my father would be of his golden child. No one bothered to look at me. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded tightly in my lap. I deal with catastrophic corporate losses every single day, but hearing my own father legally erase my value hurt worse than expected. Then Mr. Harrison reached deep into his briefcase and pulled out a small scuffed wooden box. He pushed it slowly down the polished table until it stopped in front of me. To my youngest daughter, Nora, Mr. Harrison read his voice, dropping a fraction of an inch. I leave this box and its contents. I slowly lifted the cold brass latch and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red velvet, was a standard black smartphone. It was heavy cold and completely locked. Sienna leaned over, peering at the wooden box before letting out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed loudly off the walls. A broken phone, she sneered, her voice dripping with pure venom. Dad always knew you were the absolute defective child, Nora. I guess he wanted your inheritance to match your pathetic potential. Terrence chuckled softly, tapping his expensive silver pen against the corporate folders he now controlled. He looked at me with deep, obvious disgust. "Pack up your desk by 5 o'clock today, Nora," he said coldly. "The company does not need a mediocre data analyst dragging down our payroll." I ignored their taunts and picked up the heavy device. The screen lit up instantly, demanding a secure numerical passcode. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I nervously typed in my father's birth year. The screen flashed a bright, angry red. I typed in my parents' wedding anniversary. Another angry red flash illuminated my face. Then a glaring warning message popped up on the black digital screen. Incorrect passcode entered. Device will permanently wipe all internal data in exactly 3 attempts. Next passcode attempt unlocks automatically on your 35th birthday. I stared intensely at the glowing screen, my breath catching in my throat as the massive weight of the moment finally settled over me. My 35th birthday was exactly 1 short week away. The heavy oak door clicked shut as Mr. Harrison left the conference room, leaving me completely alone with the people who shared my blood, but none of my loyalty. The ink on my father's will was not even dry yet, but Terence was already moving. He stood up from his expensive leather chair, straightening his pristine designer tie, and picked up his own sleek smartphone. He dialed a quick number and pressed it to his ear, keeping his dark, cold eyes locked intensely on my face. "Yes, this is Terence," he said into the receiver, his voice projecting pure, arrogant authority. "I need 2 armed security officers sent up to the executive boardroom immediately. We have a terminated employee who needs to be escorted off the corporate premises right now." He hung up the phone and tossed it onto the polished mahogany table. Sienna let out a soft, delighted giggle and leaned back in her chair, twirling a lock of her perfect blonde hair. I looked from her to Terence, my fingers tightening around the small wooden box holding my father's locked device. "Terminated?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "I have worked as the lead data risk analyst for Montgomery Holdings for 7 long years, Terence. I built the entire predictive modeling system that keeps this company afloat. You cannot just fire me in a law office without a valid cause." Terence smiled, a cold, calculating expression that did not reach his eyes. "I am the chief financial officer, and as of 2 minutes ago, my beautiful wife is the sole owner of the entire empire. We are restructuring the data department completely. Consider this your official notice. You have zero equity, zero leverage, and zero reason to be in my building anymore." I turned to look at my mother, hoping to find even a shred of maternal defense in her expression. Caroline was busy examining her diamond rings, refusing to meet my gaze. She let out a long, exasperated sigh that echoed loudly in the tense room. "Do not make a scene like you did at Sienna's wedding, Nora," she said, her tone dripping with bored annoyance. "You ruined her special day 5 years ago when you demanded we pay attention to your little corporate promotion while she was trying to cut her cake. Just leave quietly for once in your life. Do not embarrass us further." Her words hit exactly where she intended them to. The memory of that ruined wedding night was a bitter pill to swallow. I had worked 80-hour weeks to secure a massive corporate merger, and the moment I tried to share my hard-earned success, my mother had ordered me to leave the reception early so I would not overshadow her golden child. Now, history was repeating itself, but with infinitely higher stakes and consequences. The heavy boardroom doors swung open. 2 large security guards in dark uniforms stepped inside, looking expectantly at Terence. "Please escort my former sister-in-law to her desk so she can collect her personal items," Terence instructed, waving his right hand dismissively in my direction. "Then ensure her security badge is permanently deactivated and walk her down to the lobby. If she causes any trouble, call the police." The sheer humiliation of being treated like a criminal in the very building I had helped secure was suffocating. The guards stepped toward me, their faces blank and professional. I did not give them the satisfaction of dragging me out. I stood up carefully, placing the locked phone back inside its wooden box and tucking it securely under my arm. I walked slowly over to the coat rack in the corner of the room. As I reached out to grab my tan trench coat, Terence stepped directly into my personal space. He moved so smoothly and quietly that the large security guards did not even notice him blocking my path. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, and lowered his voice to a harsh whisper meant only for my ears. "You think losing your job is the worst thing happening to you today?" He whispered, a malicious smirk twisting his features. "You should check your mail when you get back to your little condo, Nora." I froze, gripping the fabric of my coat. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice dropping to a matching whisper. Terence leaned even closer, his breath warm against my cheek. "You honestly thought your precious father bought you that condo? Sienna and I found the paperwork last month. Your condo is heavily mortgaged and it was secretly used as collateral for a massive corporate loan I just defaulted on. The bank is foreclosing tomorrow. You are going to be living on the streets by Friday. Have a nice life. Have a nice life." Those 4 words hung in the sterile air of the executive suite like a death sentence. Terrence straightened his posture, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit jacket as if he had just finished reciting the weather forecast instead of systematically destroying my entire existence. He gave me one final condescending smirk before turning on his heel and walking back toward the boardroom, where my mother and sister were undoubtedly already popping open a bottle of vintage champagne. I stood completely frozen, clutching my tan trench coat with trembling fingers. The 2 massive security guards stepped forward, their expressions devoid of any human empathy. One of them pointed a thick finger toward the glass doors leading to the elevators. "Time to go, Miss Montgomery," he grunted. The forced walk to the elevators felt like a brutal public execution. We passed rows of glass-walled offices where my former colleagues, the people I had mentored and worked alongside for 7 long years, suddenly found their computer monitors fascinatingly interesting. Not a single person made eye contact with me. My corporate security badge was confiscated by the lead guard the moment the elevator doors slid shut. The descent to the ground floor was agonizingly slow and completely silent. My mind is a finely tuned analytical machine. I analyze corporate risk and financial vulnerabilities for a living, but I was frantically crunching the numbers, trying to make sense of what Terrence had just whispered. How could Sienna use my personal condo as collateral for a corporate loan? I had purchased it myself. Then the sickening realization hit me like a physical punch to the gut. My father had co-signed the original mortgage years ago to help me secure a better interest rate. If Sienna inherited his entire estate, she inherited his legal leverage. Terrence, the brilliant and utterly ruthless chief financial officer, would have easily found a dark legal loophole to exploit that co-signature and drain the equity right out from under me. The elevator chimed loudly, announcing our arrival at the grand marble lobby. The guards flanked me closely, marching me past the reception desk and straight toward the heavy revolving glass doors. Beyond the glass, the sky had bruised into a dark, angry purple, and a torrential Chicago downpour was washing over the busy city streets. I pushed through the heavy doors, the freezing rain instantly biting into my skin and soaking the shoulders of my coat. I hurried toward the private executive parking lot, desperate to seek the warm, familiar sanctuary of my car. But as I approached my silver sedan, I saw a tall figure stepping out from beneath the shelter of the concrete overhang. It was Terrence. He held a large black umbrella over his head, perfectly shielding his expensive suit from the raging storm. He held out his left hand with his palm facing upward. "I need the keys, Nora," he said, his voice easily cutting through the loud sound of the heavy rain. I stopped dead in my tracks, the cold water matting my hair against my face. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking from a bitter mixture of freezing cold and boiling anger. "This is my car. I have been driving it for 3 years." Terrence let out a short, amused laugh. "No, Nora. You have been driving a company-leased vehicle for 3 years. A luxury vehicle paid for entirely by Montgomery Holdings. Since you are no longer an employee, you no longer possess corporate vehicle privileges. Hand over the keys right now, or I will have the city police arrest you for grand theft auto." I stared at him, the rain running down my cheeks and blurring my vision. "You just told me the bank is taking my home, Terrence. Now you are taking my car in the middle of a massive thunderstorm. How am I supposed to get anywhere?" He smiled again, wearing that same cold, calculating smirk he wore upstairs in the boardroom. He stepped slightly closer deliberately, making sure his expensive umbrella did not offer me a single inch of cover. "The bank is foreclosing on your condo tomorrow," he said, adjusting his designer tie with his free hand. "They will be there at exactly 8 in the morning with the local sheriff to change the locks. You better call a cab and start packing your cheap clothes tonight. Good luck on the streets." My numb fingers dug deep into the wet pockets of my trench coat. I pulled out the electronic key fob and dropped it directly onto the flooded asphalt at his feet. I absolutely refused to hand it to him. Terrence scoffed, picking up the wet keys and pressing the unlock button. He climbed into the dry, luxurious leather interior of my car, leaving me standing entirely alone in the pouring rain. I watched the red taillights of the silver sedan disappear into the chaotic downtown traffic. The freezing water seeped through my clothes, chilling me straight to the bone. In less than an hour, I had been completely stripped of my career, my home, my transportation, and my family. All I had left to my name was the small, heavy wooden box tucked tightly under my arm, holding a locked piece of glass and metal that would not even turn on for another 7 days. The next 7 days felt like several agonizing months of pure survival. I walked through the freezing rain until I found a cheap, run-down motel. True to his malicious word, Terrence had ensured the bank foreclosed on my beautiful condo the very next morning. I was completely locked out of my own life. I used the last few $100s in my account to pay for a moldy room with peeling wallpaper and a mattress that felt like a slab of concrete. To keep myself from starving, I took grueling night shifts doing freelance data entry for offshore marketing firms using a battered laptop from a pawn shop. My hands cramped constantly and my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets until dawn. Meanwhile, my family was busy parading their stolen wealth for the world to see. On the eve of my 35th birthday, I sat on the edge of my lumpy motel bed eating a stale sandwich while watching the tiny static-filled television mounted on the wall. The financial news network was running a special. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "The New Power Couple of Tech." The camera panned across a glamorous charity gala, showing Sienna and Terrence stepping out of a sleek black limousine. Sienna was wearing a glittering silver gown that easily cost more than I would make in 5 years of freelance data entry. Terrence stood beside her in a custom-tailored tuxedo, smiling charismatically for the flashing cameras. The news anchor praised their visionary leadership, gushing over how seamlessly they had taken over Montgomery Holdings after my father's passing. They spoke about expanding the corporate empire and launching new software initiatives. It made me physically sick. Terrence was not a visionary. He was a ruthless parasite who had manipulated a grieving family and found a legal loophole to steal the company. And Sienna was too blinded by the cameras and the attention to realize she was just a puppet for his ambition. My mother was briefly shown in the background of the broadcast wearing a smug smile, completely ignoring the fact that her youngest daughter was currently rotting in a roadside motel. I muted the television, unable to bear the sound of their fake laughter anymore. I turned my attention to the small rickety nightstand beside the bed. Resting next to a flickering plastic lamp was the wooden box. I slowly reached out and lifted the cold black smartphone from its velvet resting place. It felt heavier tonight. Tomorrow was my 35th birthday. The device had explicitly stated that the next passcode attempt would automatically unlock on this exact date. But the terrifying warning still echoed loudly in my mind. One more incorrect guess and the device would permanently wipe all internal data. My father was a brilliant and notoriously paranoid man. If he had hidden something important enough to require a 10-year digital lock, it was something that could completely destroy Terrence and Sienna. But what could the password possibly be? I had already tried his birth year and his wedding anniversary. What else could a man who loved nobody but his company use to secure his greatest secret? I stared at the blank screen, my mind racing through numerical combinations. My brain tried to build a psychological profile of my father, predicting his final digital move. The weight of the impending failure was crushing. If I entered the wrong number tomorrow morning, I would lose my only leverage. I would be stuck in this miserable motel room doing freelance data entry for the rest of my life while they built their fake empire on my stolen foundation. I glanced up at the cheap digital clock glowing red on the motel dresser. It was 11:58 at night, 2 minutes away from my 35th birthday. The rain poured outside, beating a chaotic rhythm against the thin glass window. I gripped the dark metal edges of the phone, my thumbs hovering anxiously over the dark screen. I needed to be ready. I needed to think of the perfect sequence of numbers. The red numbers on the clock shifted to 11:59. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, mimicking the frantic pounding of the rain. I took a deep, shaky breath and closed my eyes, praying for a moment of clarity. I prepared myself to press the power button and face my absolute final chance. The clock clicked over to exactly midnight. Before my finger even grazed the cold glass, the phone suddenly vibrated violently in my hands. I gasped, opening my eyes in shock. Without a single touch, the dark screen illuminated the dark room with a blinding white light. It was unlocking itself. The blinding white light faded into a crisp, high-definition display. The terrifying passcode prompt completely vanished, melting away like a digital illusion. I let out a heavy, shaky breath, realizing it had never been about guessing the right numerical sequence. It had always been a countdown. A cruel digital waiting game programmed by my father to test my endurance. The home screen was completely empty except for a single high-resolution video file sitting dead center against a stark black background. My trembling thumb hovered over the glowing screen for a fraction of a second before I firmly tapped the play button. The video opened instantly, filling the cramped motel room with bright light. The familiar dark wood-paneled walls of my father's private executive study filled the small screen. And there he was, Richard Montgomery, sitting tall in his high-backed leather chair, looking exactly as he had a few months before his death. He looked pale and drawn from the terminal illness, but his sharp blue eyes burned with the same intense, calculating fire that had built a massive corporate empire from the ground up. He stared directly into the camera lens, as if he could see me sitting alone in the dark. "Happy birthday, my dear daughter," he said, his gravelly voice cutting sharply through the silence of the room. "You finally made it to 35. Now the real game begins." A chill ran violently down my spine. I brought the phone closer to my face, unable to tear my eyes away from his digital ghost. "I know you are probably furious with me, Nora." My father continued, leaning forward slightly and steepling his fingers together. "I know you are sitting there wondering why I humiliated you at the will reading. Why I allowed your sister and her husband to take absolutely everything while handing you a locked piece of garbage. You probably think I always favored Sienna, and that I was completely blind to what was happening inside my own company." He let out a dry, raspy chuckle, shaking his head slowly. "I was never blind, Nora. I saw everything. I watched Terrence slither his way into our family, manipulating his way into the chief financial officer position. I watched him quietly siphon millions of dollars from Montgomery Holdings into offshore bank accounts. He thought he was so incredibly smart, playing an old dying man. He cooked the books beautifully, using complex financial structures and shell companies to hide his fraudulent tracks. He truly thought he had outsmarted me." My father paused, his expression hardening into pure corporate ruthlessness. "And Sienna, my beautiful, foolish golden child. She was always too arrogant and too obsessed with her own reflection to notice her husband was looting the family vault right under her nose. She only cared about the charity galas, the designer clothes, and the prestige of the Montgomery name. She is the perfect, useful idiot for a selfish man like Terrence." I gasped loudly, my hand flying to my mouth. My father had known the truth all along. He had known Terrence was a thief, and yet he still handed the entire company over to him on a silver platter. Why would he let the villains win? As if reading my racing mind, my father answered my unspoken question. "You are an exceptional data risk analyst, Nora. You have my brain. You have my analytical mind. But you have always been far too soft. You let your mother push you around. You let Sienna take credit for your hard work. You were comfortable playing the victim in the background. I could not leave my legacy to a victim. I needed to forge a titan. I had to strip away your job, your home, and your safety net to show you what the real world looks like when you do not fight back." He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, a small, proud smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I did not give Sienna an empire, Nora. I gave her a sinking ship. Montgomery Holdings is a hollow shell drowning in the massive hidden debt Terrence created. When the banks call those loans, the entire corporate structure will instantly collapse on top of them." I handed them a ticking time bomb and tied them directly to the blast radius. The screen flickered slightly as my father reached forward toward the camera lens. "You are holding the digital keys to the real wealth, Nora. This phone contains the encrypted access codes to my private offshore servers. It holds the patents, the real estate, the intellectual property that actually generates the $65 million. Sienna owns the office desks and the massive liabilities. You own the foundation. Use your skills, follow the data, burn their fake empire to the ground, and build your own. Happy birthday, Nora. Show them what a Montgomery can really do. The video abruptly cut to black, leaving me staring at my own shocked reflection in the dark glass. My heart was pounding furiously, but the fear and despair that had consumed me for the last week were completely gone. They were instantly replaced by an icy sharp focus and a burning desire for absolute revenge. I wiped away any lingering moisture from my eyes and shifted my weight on the uncomfortable motel mattress. I am a data risk analyst. My entire career has been built on dismantling digital fortresses, hunting down hidden financial liabilities, and exposing corporate vulnerabilities. My father knew exactly what he was doing when he handed me this specific puzzle. I swiped past the black screen of the video file and found a single application icon sitting isolated on the empty home screen. It was a custom-built, highly encrypted secure browser. I tapped the icon, and my screen immediately filled with cascading lines of complex routing code. I grabbed my pawnshop laptop and connected the smartphone using a frayed data cable. It took me less than 2 hours to decipher the encryption keys my father had programmed. He had set up secondary firewalls not to keep me out, but to verify my identity through the specific analytical methodology I used. The digital breadcrumbs bounced rapidly through several anonymous proxy servers across the globe before finally anchoring to a hidden physical server located in a highly secure data center in Geneva, Switzerland. This was the real vault. Inside the server, I found gigabytes of meticulously organized financial data. My father had not just left me the keys to his hidden empire, he had left me the exact forensic blueprint of Terrence's massive corporate crimes. I opened the master ledger file and began cross-referencing the data. For the past 4 years, Terrence had been systematically bleeding Montgomery Holdings dry. He had set up a complex web of anonymous shell companies scattered across the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. Every single financial quarter, Terrence would authorize massive corporate wire transfers under the clever guise of international software development initiatives. But the money never went to any actual software vendors. Terrence was funneling the stolen corporate cash directly into offshore cryptocurrency accounts, making the funds completely untraceable to the average corporate auditor. But I was not an average auditor. I traced the complex blockchain transaction hashes, matching them perfectly with the fake vendor invoices my father had archived. Terrence had stolen nearly $20 million in liquid cash. The most twisted part of his entire scheme was the signature on the final authorization forms. It was never his signature. It was always Sienna's. Terrence had manipulated his own arrogant wife into blindly signing the fraudulent transfer documents, making her the sole legal target for any federal investigation. He was actively planning to take the stolen millions and flee, leaving her holding the bag when the corporate structure inevitably collapsed. The terrifying reality became crystal clear. Montgomery Holdings was running on empty. The lavish charity galas, the sprawling Hamptons mansion, and the luxury cars my sister proudly flaunted on television were all financed by predatory loans secured against the company's dwindling assets. Terrence had hollowed out the company from the inside out. My father had let him do it, knowing full well that I would be the one with the skills to finally burn the parasite out. I spent the rest of the night downloading the damning digital evidence onto a secure flash drive. The sun was just beginning to rise over the cold Chicago skyline, casting a pale gray light through the dirty motel window. I stretched my aching back, feeling a massive surge of pure adrenaline. I had the weapon. I knew exactly how their fake empire operated. Now I just needed to choose my very first target. My cheap prepaid burner phone suddenly buzzed loudly on the rickety nightstand. I picked it up, expecting another automated spam message. Instead, I saw a long text from an unsaved number, but I instantly recognized the highly demanding tone. It was my mother, Caroline. Nora. I need you to wire me $5,000 immediately, the text read. Sienna just had the absolute audacity to cut off my platinum credit card because Terrence said the family needs to tighten our personal budgets. I have an important country club luncheon to host tomorrow afternoon, and I will absolutely not be humiliated in front of my wealthy friends. Send the money right now. I stared at the bright screen, a slow, cold smile spreading across my tired face. My mother was demanding money from the daughter she had gleefully allowed to be thrown onto the freezing street just to fund her superficial lifestyle. The absolute irony was almost poetic. I did not have $5,000 to give her, but I had something much more dangerous. I had the truth. It was time to make my first move and let the dominoes fall. I sent a brief text back to my mother, telling her to meet me at a local diner on the edge of the city. I knew she would absolutely hate the location, but if she wanted my money, she had to come to my territory. I gathered the printed documents I had just run off at a cheap corner copy shop and tucked them into my worn leather tote bag. The diner was a greasy spoon with cracked vinyl booths flickering neon lights and the overwhelming smell of burnt coffee and old frying oil. It was the absolute last place anyone would ever expect to find the proud matriarch of the Montgomery family. I sat alone in a dark corner booth nursing a black coffee when the diner door violently swung open. My mother walked in clutching her designer handbag tightly to her chest as if she expected to be robbed at any given moment. She wore large, dark sunglasses and a pristine white cashmere coat that practically screamed old money. She scanned the dingy room with a look of profound disgust before finally spotting me. She marched over and slid into the booth across from me, refusing to take off her expensive sunglasses. "This place is a complete health hazard, Nora," she snapped, wiping down the sticky table with a monogrammed napkin from her purse. "I cannot believe you dragged me all the way out to this terrible neighborhood. Did you bring the $5,000 or not? I have the head caterer for the country club luncheon breathing down my neck, and I absolutely refuse to be embarrassed simply because your sister is having a selfish power trip." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, watching her panic over a meaningless social luncheon while completely ignoring the fact that she had let Terrence throw me out of my home. "Tell me exactly what happened with Sienna," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured. My mother let out a dramatic sigh, leaning forward aggressively. "It is Terrence," she complained, her voice dripping with pure indignation. "He convinced Sienna to freeze my platinum credit card yesterday afternoon. He told her that since your father passed away, the company needs to consolidate assets and that my monthly allowance was an unnecessary drain on the corporate accounts." Sienna just nodded along like a foolish little puppy, agreeing with every single word he said. Can you believe the absolute disrespect? I am the one who built the social standing of this family. I am the one who introduced your father to the right politicians and investors. And now I am being treated like a financial burden by my own daughter. She paused, expecting me to sympathize or perhaps apologize for my temporary lack of funds. She even had the audacity to tap her manicured fingernails against the table, waiting for me to hand over the cash. Instead, I reached slowly into my tote bag. I did not feel a single ounce of anger toward her anymore. Anger requires emotional investment, and I had completely divested from this toxic family. All I felt was the cold, calculating precision of a data risk analyst executing a perfectly planned strategy. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed bank statement from the encrypted Geneva server, highlighting a very specific and massive offshore wire transfer. I placed the document onto the sticky diner table and slowly slid it across to her. "You should not be mad at Sienna, Mom," I said, my tone deadly quiet and entirely devoid of emotion. "She has absolutely no idea what is actually happening. She does not even control her own bank accounts right now." My mother frowned, looking down at the piece of paper in confusion. "What is this garbage, Nora? I do not have time to look at your little data spreadsheets. I need cash immediately to pay the vendors." I leaned forward and tapped my index finger directly on the highlighted row of numbers. "You should ask Terrence why your $3 million private retirement fund was abruptly liquidated and moved to a corporate shell company in the Cayman Islands." Last Tuesday, I said. My mother froze. She slowly lowered her dark sunglasses, peering closely at the document. I watched her eyes scan the page, tracking the flow of the money. The routing numbers, the offshore destination, the digital signature authorizing the massive transfer. It was all right there in black and white. Terrence had not just cut off her credit card. He had completely drained her entire life savings while telling Sienna it was just a simple budget cut. Her hands began to tremble violently. The pristine white cashmere suddenly looked far too heavy for her shrinking frame. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and utterly terrified. "This cannot be real," she whispered, her voice cracking as the devastating reality set in. "Terrence manages that account. He told me the funds were locked in a secure high-yield municipal bond. He promised your father he would protect my retirement." "Terrence is a parasite," I replied simply, taking another sip of my coffee. "He is stealing everything, Mom. And he is using Sienna's digital signature to do it. So when the federal investigators finally show up, she will be the one going to federal prison." My mother did not say another word. The reality of her total financial ruin had just shattered her superficial world. She frantically dug into her designer handbag with shaking fingers and pulled out her smartphone. Her breathing grew shallow and panicked as she hastily dialed Terrence's private number. I sat back against the cracked vinyl booth and watched the first domino begin to fall. Terrence sent my mother's desperate call straight to voicemail. Caroline was not a woman who accepted being ignored, especially when her fortune was on the line. She shoved her phone into her handbag, stood up from the booth without another word to me, and marched out. I finished my black coffee, knowing exactly where she was heading. She was going to the source of the betrayal to demand respect. Half an hour later, my mother pushed her way past the security gates of Sienna's luxury mansion. She stormed through the double doors, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floors. Sienna and Terrence were sitting in the living room, sipping mimosas and reviewing guest lists for their charity gala. "Terrence, what did you do with my money?" my mother screamed, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Sienna jumped, spilling her drink. "Mom, what on earth is wrong with you?" she asked, wide-eyed. "You cannot barge into our home screaming like a crazy person." Caroline ignored her golden child completely. She marched straight up to Terrence and threw the printed bank statement directly into his face. The paper fluttered to the floor between his leather shoes. "Where is my $3 million retirement fund?" "Terrence," my mother demanded, her chest heaving. "That document shows you liquidated my municipal bonds and wired the balance to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. You stole my life savings." Terrence did not flinch. He slowly set his champagne flute down. He picked up the paper, smoothing the wrinkles with calm, steady hands. He scanned the document briefly before letting out a patronizing sigh. He looked at my mother with deep manufactured pity. "Caroline, this is completely fabricated," he said, his voice smooth and soothing. "Where did you get this ridiculous paper?" "Let me guess. You went to see Nora today." My mother opened her mouth to speak, but Terrence cut her off, towering over her. "Nora is deeply unwell," Terrence continued, shaking his head sadly. "She was fired. She lost her condo. She is lashing out, trying to destroy our family by feeding you forged bank documents. Think about it. Why would I steal your money when Sienna and I sit on a $65 million empire? It makes no logical sense." But the routing numbers, my mother stammered, her confidence wavering under his psychological manipulation. "The digital signatures are easily faked by a bitter data analyst." Terrence interrupted, his tone hardening. "I moved your funds into a secure private equity tier to protect them from estate taxes. You are acting completely hysterical. You are letting Nora's toxic jealousy tear us apart." Sienna stood up, linking her arm tightly through Terrence's. She glared at our mother with absolute disgust. "I cannot believe you would listen to Nora over my own husband, Mom." Sienna spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Terrence has done nothing but protect this family since Dad died. Nora is just a pathetic liar." "Sienna, please look at the numbers," my mother pleaded, tears spilling over her mascara. "Get out, Mom." Sienna commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the front doors. If you let that jealous loser manipulate you into insulting my husband in our home, you are no longer welcome here. Do not come back until you apologize to Terrence. My mother stood frozen, staring at the daughter she had worshipped her entire life. For the very first time, Caroline realized Sienna's loyalty could easily be bought, and Terrence held the purse strings. Utterly defeated and broken, my mother turned and walked slowly out of the mansion. Her world of high society privilege had collapsed, leaving her isolated. She had chosen the wrong daughter to protect, and now she was paying the ultimate price. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing the permanent fracture between them. Sienna let out an annoyed huff and went to the kitchen to pour another mimosa, but Terrence's confident facade instantly vanished the second his wife left the room. He quickly bent down, picking up the printed bank statement again. His dark eyes scanned the specific routing codes at the bottom. Only he knew those exact proxy sequences. Nora could not have forged this. He crushed the paper in his fist, his heart pounding with cold, terrifying dread. Terrence hurried down the hallway and locked himself inside his private executive study. He ripped open his highly secure laptop and rapidly typed his encrypted passwords. He bypassed his own firewalls, checking the security logs of his offshore Cayman accounts. A bright red notification flashed across his dark screen. Last night, someone using a hidden Geneva server had successfully breached his master ledger. He was no longer the only one who knew the truth. Terrence sat frozen in his leather chair, the red notification reflecting off his dark eyes. The master ledger was his ultimate insurance policy, and now it was compromised. He typed lines of code trying to trace the digital intruder, but the connection had vanished. Whoever breached the server was a ghost. His mind raced back to his conversation with Caroline. She had brought a printed bank statement, a statement that came from this exact ledger, and Caroline had just visited Nora. The realization hit him like a freight train. Nora had not just found a way into the accounts, she was actively weaponizing the data. He slammed his laptop shut, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He had hours before the business day started. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the glass skyscraper of Montgomery Holdings was deceptively calm. At 8 in the morning, the senior members of the board of directors gathered in the executive boardroom for their routine quarterly briefing. Chairman Davis, an imposing man who had helped my father build the company from the ground up, took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table. He opened his sleek silver tablet to review the morning agenda. At exactly 8:15, every single tablet and smartphone in the soundproof boardroom chimed simultaneously. It was an automated email delivery from a completely untraceable sender address. Chairman Davis opened the message, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. The email contained no text. It only held a single attached PDF file titled Internal Audit Fraction 1. As the board opened the file, the room descended into shocked silence. The document contained a highly detailed snapshot of exactly 4 wire transfers made during the previous fiscal quarter. The transfers totaled over $7 million. The money had moved from the corporate operational fund directly into an unregistered shell company in the British Virgin Islands. The routing numbers, the corporate authorization codes, and the exact timestamps were all fully documented. It was undeniable proof of massive corporate embezzlement. 10 minutes later, Terrence's office phone rang, instructing him to report to the boardroom immediately. Terrence adjusted his designer tie, his heart hammering against his ribs. He walked down the hallway, trying to maintain his signature mask of arrogant confidence. When he pushed open the heavy oak doors, he found all 6 board members staring at him with expressions of pure hostility. Chairman Davis did not offer him a seat. He simply turned his tablet around and pushed it across the table. Terrence looked down at the screen and felt the blood drain from his face. It was the exact ledger fragment he had seen breached the night before. "Can you explain why $7 million of our capital is sitting in an offshore tax haven?" Terrence Chairman Davis asked, his voice dangerously low. "You are the chief financial officer. Nothing moves without your final approval. We are initiating an emergency independent audit starting today. If these funds are missing, we will be calling the federal authorities before the sun goes down. Terrence's mind spun wildly. He knew the board was ruthless. If he showed even a fraction of guilt, they would lock him in the building and call the police immediately. He forced a calm, composed smile onto his face. I assure you, gentlemen, this is a complete misunderstanding. Terrence lied. These transfers were part of a confidential international software acquisition that my wife Sienna authorized last quarter. The shell company is simply a holding vehicle. I will provide the full authorization paperwork by this afternoon to clear up any confusion. Chairman Davis narrowed his eyes but nodded slowly. You have until 4 o'clock, Terrence. Do not leave this building. Terrence walked out of the boardroom, his back soaked in sweat. He was officially being hunted, and the walls were rapidly closing in. He hurried back to his private office and locked the door behind him. He had promised the board authorization paperwork that proved the transfers were legitimate business acquisitions. Those documents did not exist. If the auditors dug into the accounts, they would see he stole the money to buy cryptocurrency. He sat down and opened his secure laptop, his hands trembling slightly. He needed a perfect scapegoat to take the fall for the missing millions. He pulled up the digital corporate authorization files. He began meticulously doctoring the internal network timestamps and IP address logs. He systematically altered the digital trail to make it look as though the fraudulent transfers had originated directly from Sienna's private home network. He forged her digital signature on 4 new fake acquisition contracts. He was actively throwing his own wife to the wolves without a single second of hesitation, simply to save himself from federal prison. Terrence hit print on his secure laptop, watching the 4 fraudulent acquisition contracts slide smoothly out of the office printer. The digital trail was now perfectly altered to point directly at Sienna's private computer. But he needed her physical signature on these hard copies to completely solidify the trap. He gathered the warm papers and placed them into a sleek leather folder. He left his executive office and drove his sports car back to their sprawling mansion. He found Sienna lounging by the indoor heated pool, wearing a silk robe and sipping a glowing green detox smoothie while a private manicurist worked on her nails. Terrence walked over, putting on his best mask of the loving, protective husband. He kissed the top of her blonde head and let out a heavy manufactured sigh. Sienna looked up at him with mild annoyance for interrupting her spa time. What is wrong? She asked, holding her hand perfectly still for the manicurist. Terrence opened the leather folder and presented the papers. Just some incredibly boring compliance paperwork from the legal department, he lied smoothly. The board is being overly cautious about those international software acquisitions you authorized last quarter. They need you to physically sign these updated addendums so the auditors will get off our backs. Sienna rolled her eyes, letting out a dramatic groan. Why do they bother me with this administrative garbage? She complained. That is literally what we pay you to handle, Terrence. I know, baby, he said, handing her an expensive gold pen. But because you are the chief executive officer, your signature is the only one that satisfies the federal compliance officers. Just sign the bottom lines, and I will take care of the rest. I promise. Sienna did not even glance at the dense paragraphs of legal text. She did not read the offshore account numbers or the massive financial figures. She simply took the gold pen and scribbled her elegant signature across all 4 pages, unknowingly signing her own confession to a multi-million-dollar federal crime. Terrence smiled, taking the folder back. Across the city, I was sitting cross-legged on my lumpy motel mattress, staring intensely at the glowing screen of my pawn-shop laptop. I had not slept in over 24 hours, but I felt absolutely electric. I had set up multiple anonymous digital tripwires across the corporate network, and I could see the exact moment the board of directors initiated the emergency independent audit. But I did not stop there. Corporate audits can be quietly swept under the rug if the board decides the public relations fallout is too damaging. I needed to force their hand entirely. Using a secure encrypted email proxy, I anonymously tipped off a prominent Wall Street financial journalist about the missing $7 million. Now I watched as the breaking news ticker flashed across the bottom of the financial news network. Rumors of massive internal embezzlement at Montgomery Holdings had officially hit the market. I switched my browser tab to the live stock exchange feed. The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely brutal. The stock price of Montgomery Holdings began to plummet in real time. I watched the green numbers turn instantly to a violently dropping red line. 10%, 15%, 20%. Millions of dollars in corporate valuation were evaporating into thin air with every passing second. Sienna and Terrence were actively bleeding out on the public stage, and they had absolutely no idea how to stop the hemorrhage. Back at the corporate headquarters, Terrence was watching the exact same red lines dropping on his office monitors. Panic was finally clawing at his throat. The forged documents would buy him a little bit of time with the board of directors, but he knew the federal investigators would eventually dig deeper. He needed to find the anonymous leaker and silence them permanently before they released the rest of the offshore ledger. Terrence picked up his burner phone and dialed a number he kept hidden from everyone. Within an hour, a man in a rumpled suit sat across from Terrence's mahogany desk. He was a high-end private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and illegal digital tracking. Terrence slid a thick envelope of cash across the desk, along with a printed copy of the encrypted email the board had received that morning. "I do not care what laws you have to break," Terrence said, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "I need to know exactly where this email originated. Find the physical location of the server or track the digital footprint of the sender." The investigator pocketed the cash and opened his own laptop. He spent 45 minutes running aggressive reverse tracing algorithms, piercing through the cheap anonymous proxies I had hastily set up. Terrence paced the office like a caged animal. Finally, the investigator hit the enter key and leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. He turned his laptop screen around to face Terrence. A digital map of Chicago was displayed with a blinking red dot pinned to a specific location on the outer edge of the city. "I found the origin signal," the investigator said quietly. "It is pinging from an unsecured Wi-Fi router at a cheap roadside motel on the south side." Terrence stared at the blinking red dot, a chilling realization washing over him. The trail led directly to my door. I was staring at my pawnshop laptop screen finalizing the next batch of encrypted emails when the sudden sound of screeching tires echoed violently from the motel parking lot. My survival instincts flared immediately. I quietly closed the laptop, pushing it deep under the thin, lumpy mattress. I reached for my father's locked smartphone resting on the rickety nightstand. I quickly tapped a very specific sequence on the dark screen, opening a hidden background application, before setting the device back down face up. Less than a minute later, heavy, frantic footsteps pounded against the exterior concrete walkway leading directly to my room. The flimsy wooden door to my motel room did not just swing open, it violently splintered inward, the cheap metal deadbolt tearing completely out of the rotted doorframe. Terrence stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. His expensive, custom-tailored suit was completely rumpled, his silk tie was pulled loose, and his dark eyes were wild with a feral, desperate panic. The arrogant, perfectly composed chief financial officer, who had mocked me mercilessly at the will reading, was completely gone. He stepped inside the cramped room and kicked the broken door shut behind him, leaning his heavy frame against it to trap me inside. He did not speak right away. He simply glared at me sitting calmly on the edge of the bed. Then he unzipped a heavy black canvas duffel bag he had slung tightly over his broad shoulder and aggressively dumped its contents directly onto the stained carpet. Hundreds of thick banded stacks of $100 bills tumbled out, forming a massive green mountain of cold hard cash right at my feet. $500,000, Nora, he barked, his voice tight and shaking with barely controlled rage. $500,000 in completely untraceable cash. It is yours right now. All you have to do is hand over your father's phone and give me the master encryption passwords to the Geneva server. Take the money, buy a nice new house, and walk away from this family forever. I looked down at the massive pile of stolen corporate money and let out a soft, dry laugh. I slowly shook my head, folding my hands neatly in my lap. You really think you can just buy your way out of federal prison, Terrence? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Terrence's face contorted with pure, unadulterated anger. He viciously kicked a thick stack of bills toward me, sending the money scattering across the dirty floor. You have always been the pathetic loser of this family, Nora, he sneered, taking a slow, menacing step closer to the bed. Your parents never cared about you. Your own father humiliated you in front of everyone, giving you a broken phone, while he handed my beautiful wife the entire kingdom. You spent your whole miserable life hiding in the background, crunching numbers while Sienna and I lived the glamorous life you secretly craved. You are nothing but a bitter, jealous spinster trying to play a high-stakes corporate game you do not even understand. Take the money before I completely destroy you. I did not flinch at his cruel words. You are entirely wrong, Terence, I replied, my voice dropping to an icy, dangerous whisper. My father knew exactly what he was doing. He knew you were a greedy thief, and he knew Sienna was a blind fool. He gave you a hollow shell of a company drowning in the massive debt you created. The prestigious kingdom you think you rule is actively burning to the ground, and I am the one holding the matches. The cash on this floor means absolutely nothing to me. I want you to lose everything you stole. Terence lunged forward, crossing the small gap between us in a fraction of a second. He grabbed me roughly by the shoulders of my cheap sweater, hauling me forcefully to my feet and slamming my back hard against the peeling motel wallpaper. His face was mere inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and pure, suffocating fear. You listen to me very carefully, you stupid little girl, he hissed, his thick fingers digging painfully into my collarbones. I will not let you ruin my life. I will not go to a federal penitentiary because of some defective data analyst. If you do not give me that phone and shut down those leaks right now, I swear to God I will kill you. I will snap your neck in this filthy motel room and dump your body in the river. No one in your family will even care that you are gone. Sienna and your mother will probably thank me for finally getting rid of you. I stared directly into his furious, manic eyes, refusing to show him even a single ounce of fear or submission. He truly thought he had completely cornered me. He thought physical intimidation would easily break the woman who had already survived the absolute worst emotional abuse this family had to offer. Terence was so utterly blinded by his own violent arrogance that he did not even look at the rickety nightstand just 2 feet away. He had absolutely no idea that my father's smartphone was glowing with a faint, steady red light, actively broadcasting every single word of his murderous threats and his full corporate confession to a highly secure cloud server directly linked to the federal authorities. His hands were still clamped tightly around my shoulders, his eyes burning with violent intent. He opened his mouth to hurl another deadly threat when a sharp, piercing ringtone suddenly shattered the tense silence of the motel room. It was an emergency override tone coming directly from the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket. Terence flinched, his ingrained corporate instincts briefly overriding his primal rage. He shoved me backward onto the lumpy mattress and frantically pulled his expensive phone out. I watched his furious expression instantly drop into a mask of pure, absolute terror. I knew exactly who was calling him because I had manipulated the data to trigger automated alerts notifying our primary corporate lenders the moment our stock price dropped past a catastrophic threshold. Terence pressed the phone to his ear, his hand shaking uncontrollably. "Yes, this is the chief financial officer," he stammered, his voice completely losing its arrogant, authoritative edge. Even from across the small, cramped room, I could hear the cold, uncompromising voice of the senior loan officer. The public allegations of massive internal embezzlement and the devastating plunge in your stock valuation have officially triggered the material adverse change clause in your primary corporate loan, the banker stated flatly. We are formally calling the debt Terrence. We require an immediate transfer of $20 million in liquid cash within 48 hours. If the funds are not fully settled in our accounts by then, we will initiate an aggressive hostile takeover and seize every single asset belonging to Montgomery Holdings. Terrence swallowed hard, his skin turning an unnatural shade of gray. You cannot do this, he pleaded desperately, sweating profusely. We have international acquisitions processing right now. You have to give me at least 30 days to liquidate some of our secondary properties. 48 hours, Terrence the banker replied coldly, before the line abruptly went dead. Terrence slowly lowered the phone, staring blankly at the dark screen. The reality of his complete financial destruction had finally arrived. Killing me in a cheap motel room would not magically manifest $20 million to stop the massive bank from seizing the empire he had worked so incredibly hard to steal. He looked down at the massive pile of $100 bills scattered across the stained carpet and realized it was barely a fraction of what he now owed. He did not even bother picking up the stolen cash. He turned around and bolted out the splintered doorway, running back to his sports car like a terrified child fleeing a waking nightmare. I reached over and calmly ended the cloud recording, securely locking the digital evidence away. The trap was now fully armed and completely inescapable. Terrence sped recklessly back to the executive offices where Sienna was currently having a complete nervous breakdown. She had seen the stock market freefall on the news and was pacing frantically across the thick carpets of the executive boardroom. When Terrence burst through the heavy doors, she ran to him demanding answers. The bank just called the debt. He gasped, struggling to catch his breath. They want $20 million by Friday, or they are taking the entire company, Sienna. We have to wire the emergency reserve funds right now. Sienna rushed to the boardroom laptop, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she aggressively typed in her chief executive credentials. She navigated to the primary corporate banking portal to authorize the massive wire transfer. But when the account dashboard finally loaded, she let out a blood-curdling scream. The operating accounts were completely empty. "Where is the money, Terrence?" she shrieked, pointing frantically at the screen displaying a balance of absolutely zero. "We are supposed to have $40 million in liquid reserves. Where did it all go?" Terrence backed away, his mind racing to construct another lie to save his own skin. The federal auditors must have initiated an emergency freeze on our liquid assets because of the anonymous email leak. He lied, smoothly masking his massive internal panic. We cannot access the cash right now. Sienna collapsed into a leather chair, gripping her blonde hair. Her entire identity was built on being a wealthy, powerful socialite. She could not imagine the sheer public humiliation of the bank publicly foreclosing on her empire. Her country club friends would laugh at her. The media would brand her a catastrophic failure. Her fragile ego simply could not handle the idea of absolute public bankruptcy. "We cannot let the bank take it," she whispered, her eyes wide with desperate panic. "If they seize the company, I will be a laughingstock. I will lose everything." She suddenly sat up straight, her eyes flashing with a wild, reckless idea. She grabbed her phone and scrolled rapidly through her exclusive contacts until she found the private number for the chief executive officer of our biggest corporate rival. "I am going to sell the company," she declared, her voice trembling with misplaced determination. "I will sell Montgomery Holdings for pennies on the dollar right now just to cover the bank debt and walk away with our dignity intact. I am scheduling an emergency shareholder vote for tomorrow morning." She was entirely unaware that by trying to escape the sinking ship she was walking directly into my final trap. While Sienna frantically dialed the number for her corporate rival, I was sitting in my quiet motel room, preparing to execute the final phase of my father's brilliant strategy. The sun had fully risen, casting a harsh morning light across my pawnshop laptop. I had completely dismantled Terrence's fake financial empire and exposed his massive offshore fraud. But that was only the first part of the game. Destroying the villains was satisfying, but claiming my rightful inheritance was the ultimate goal. I picked up the heavy black smartphone my father had left me. There was one final folder sitting alone on the secure home screen. It was locked behind a complex military-grade encryption wall that had taken me all night to slowly decrypt. I connected the phone back to my laptop and ran the final decryption algorithm. A green progress bar filled the screen before flashing a successful bypass notification. The folder clicked open, revealing a massive cache of highly classified legal documents. I opened the first file, and my breath completely caught in my throat. It was not a bank statement or a hidden cryptocurrency ledger. It was a massive ironclad legal charter for a private corporate trust established in the state of Delaware. The state of Delaware is famous in the corporate world for its impenetrable privacy laws and ultimate asset protection. My father had named the entity the Nora Montgomery Private Trust. I scrolled rapidly through the hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning the detailed asset transfer logs. 5 years ago, right around the time my mother and sister humiliated me at that wedding reception, my father had secretly restructured the entire foundation of Montgomery Holdings. He had methodically removed every single valuable asset from the primary corporate registry and transferred it directly into this impenetrable Delaware trust. I stared at the screen in pure absolute shock. The trust owned all the proprietary software algorithms that I had personally spent years developing. It owned every single technology patent the company used to generate its millions. It owned the trademark name and the corporate logo. It even held the physical deed to the expensive real estate right underneath the towering Chicago headquarters. My father had completely gutted the company from the inside out, leaving only the operational facade. Montgomery Holdings did not actually own anything. For the past 5 years, the company had been quietly paying a massive monthly licensing fee to the Nora Montgomery Private Trust, just to use its own name and software. Terrence was so incredibly focused on stealing the liquid cash from the operational accounts that he never even bothered to check who actually owned the bedrock of the empire. He had stolen millions from a company that was essentially just renting its entire existence from my father. And now, according to the legally binding documents glowing brightly on my laptop screen, that entire existence was rented directly from me. I opened the final legal addendum signed by my father just weeks before his death. It named me as the sole exclusive trustee and the singular beneficiary of the Nora Montgomery Private Trust. I held absolute unilateral control over every single patent, trademark, and piece of land the company relied on to survive. My father had not given Sienna a $65 million empire. He had given her a massive pile of corporate debt and a signed lease agreement. He had given me the actual kingdom. I sat back on the lumpy motel mattress, a powerful wave of realization washing over me. Sienna was currently running around her expensive mansion, desperately trying to sell the company to a rival conglomerate to pay off the angry bank. But she could not sell it. No intelligent corporate buyer would ever purchase Montgomery Holdings once they looked at the actual asset sheets during the due diligence phase. They would instantly realize they were buying nothing but office chairs, computers, and massive federal tax liabilities. The true billion-dollar value was locked away in a private trust that only I controlled. Sienna did not own the company intellectual property. She merely licensed it from the trust. And as the sole trustee, I had the absolute legal right to terminate that licensing agreement at any given moment, effectively shutting down the entire corporation overnight. Sienna was planning to walk into that executive boardroom tomorrow morning to sign away the company and escape her massive debt. She was entirely unaware that I was going to be waiting for her. The morning of the emergency shareholder vote dawned crisp and clear over the city of Chicago. The torrential rain from the previous week had finally washed away, leaving a bright blue sky that felt like a clean slate. I woke up on the lumpy motel mattress for the very last time. I did not feel tired. I did not feel scared. The terrified data risk analyst, who had been violently thrown onto the street, was completely dead. In her place stood the sole trustee of a billion-dollar corporate empire. I packed up my pawn shop laptop and placed my father's locked smartphone securely inside my tote bag. My first stop was an all-night professional printing center located a few blocks from the financial district. I paid the clerk to print the entire 500-page Delaware private trust document on high-quality heavy stock paper. I stood by the massive commercial printers listening to the rhythmic mechanical hum as page after page of undeniable legal proof slid into the tray. When the printing was finished, I had the clerk bind the massive stack of documents inside a thick black leather folder. I picked it up, feeling the substantial physical weight of the paperwork in my hands. It was the absolute weight of my vengeance. I could not walk into the executive boardroom looking like a homeless victim. Terrence and Sienna relied heavily on appearances to maintain their power. They judged everyone by the brand of their clothes and the price of their shoes. To completely destroy them in front of the board of directors and the rival corporate buyers, I needed to speak their visual language. I needed armor. I checked my depleted bank account. I had exactly $640 left to my name. It was every single penny I possessed in the world. I walked straight into a high-end designer boutique located in the luxury shopping district. The impeccably dressed saleswoman took one look at my cheap, worn-out sweater and my scuffed shoes, and immediately frowned, preparing to ask me to leave. Before she could speak, I walked directly to the premium businesswear section and pulled a stunning, sharp, dark charcoal designer suit from the display rack. I went into the dressing room and stripped off the cheap clothes of my past. I slipped into the expertly tailored trousers and buttoned the structured blazer. The charcoal fabric fit perfectly, hugging my shoulders with commanding authority. I brushed out my hair, pulling it back into a sleek, severe knot at the nape of my neck. I applied a sharp coat of dark red lipstick. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, and I barely recognized the woman staring back. The soft, submissive sister who had always lowered her eyes to avoid conflict was completely gone. The woman in the mirror looked exactly like Richard Montgomery. She looked ruthless. I walked out to the register and handed the saleswoman the suit tags along with all of my remaining cash. I walked out of the boutique with $0 in my pocket, but I had never felt wealthier in my entire life. I hailed a yellow city cab and gave the driver the address for Montgomery Holdings. The ride through the busy downtown streets felt incredibly surreal. Just a few days ago, I had been shivering in the back of a cab, crying over losing my career and my home. Today I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on the heavy black leather folder. The cab pulled up to the curb and I stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk. I tilted my head back, looking up at the towering glass and steel skyscraper of Montgomery Holdings. The morning sun reflected blindingly off the massive windows. It was the exact same building Terrence had proudly ordered his armed security guards to drag me out of. He had promised me I would end up on the streets. I straightened my charcoal blazer, gripping the heavy leather folder tightly in my right hand. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped into the grand marble lobby. The morning rush was in full swing, with hundreds of corporate employees rushing past the security turnstiles holding their coffees and briefcases. I recognized many of them. My former colleagues, the people who had turned their heads and ignored me when I was being escorted out in disgrace. The two large security guards standing by the main elevator bank immediately noticed my approach. They were the exact same men who had confiscated my corporate badge and forced me out into the freezing rain. They stepped forward, preparing to block my path, assuming I was a disgruntled former employee coming back to cause trouble. They had no idea I was the owner of the building. The two security guards moved to intercept me, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. But I did not stop or lower my gaze. I kept my shoulders perfectly straight and looked directly through them with an expression of absolute ice. The sheer confidence radiating from my dark charcoal suit and my unyielding posture made them hesitate for a fraction of a second. In the corporate world, hesitation is surrender. I walked right past them without breaking my stride and stepped into the open executive elevator, pressing the button for the top floor. The doors slid shut, leaving them staring in confusion. The ride up to the executive suite felt incredibly fast. My heart beat in a steady, controlled rhythm. When the elevator dinged and the polished steel doors opened, I stepped out onto the thick plush carpet of the penthouse level. The receptionist at the front desk opened her mouth to speak, but I walked past her before she could even form a word. I knew exactly where I was going. I had spent 7 years walking these very halls, analyzing every risk this company faced. Now I was the biggest risk of all. Inside the massive glass-walled boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with tense desperation masking itself as a historic corporate merger. Sienna sat at the head of the long mahogany table, trying her best to look like a powerful chief executive officer. She wore a bright red designer dress and an overly bright smile, but her eyes betrayed her absolute panic. Sitting across from her was the chief executive officer of our largest corporate rival, a seasoned billionaire named Mr. Caldwell. He looked like a shark who had just found blood in the water. He knew Montgomery Holdings was bleeding from the sudden stock market crash, and he was here to feast on the remains. Standing directly behind Sienna was Terrence. He was sweating profusely despite the heavy air conditioning in the room. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, glancing nervously at his expensive gold watch. I could clearly see the distinct rectangular outline of his international passport pressing against the inside breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He had his escape route fully planned out. The moment Sienna signed those merger documents and the rival company assumed their massive banking debts, Terrence was going to walk straight out of the building, hail a cab to the international airport, and disappear to the Bahamas forever. He was entirely ready to leave his foolish wife behind to deal with the federal fallout. Sienna picked up her heavy gold pen. "I am so glad we could come to this mutually beneficial agreement, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. "This merger will secure the Montgomery legacy for generations to come and stabilize our market valuation." Mr. Caldwell offered a tight, predatory smile and tapped his thick finger on the dotted line. "Just sign the transfer papers, Sienna," he replied smoothly. "Let us finalize this deal before the markets close today so my team can take over your operations by tomorrow morning." Sienna lowered the gold pen to the thick stack of paper. Her hand trembled slightly. This was the exact moment she was giving away our father's entire life work just to save her own fragile ego from public embarrassment and bankruptcy. I did not knock. I placed both of my hands firmly on the heavy oak double doors and shoved them open with every ounce of strength I possessed. The doors slammed violently against the boardroom walls, echoing like a gunshot through the silent room. Every single head in the room snapped in my direction. The board of directors gasped in collective shock. Mr. Caldwell raised a thick gray eyebrow in surprise at the sudden intrusion. Sienna froze the gold pen, hovering just a millimeter above the signature line. She stared at me, her eyes wide with absolute shock, before her expression rapidly twisted into a mask of cruel mockery. She looked at my sharp designer suit and let out a loud, condescending laugh that broke the stunned silence of the room. "What on earth is this?" she sneered, pointing her gold pen at me. "Who let the homeless girl into the building? Did you spend your last unemployment check on a fake designer suit, Nora? We are in the middle of a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. Get out of my boardroom before I have you arrested for trespassing. Security. Someone call security right now." Terrence stepped forward, his face turning an ashen gray. He knew I had the server data, but he had no idea why I was standing there looking like I owned the world. "Nora, leave this room immediately," he commanded, his voice cracking with pure panic. I completely ignored both of them. I did not look at my sister, and I did not look at the man who had threatened to kill me the day before. I walked with slow, measured steps straight past my panicked family members, holding the heavy black leather folder in my hands. I stopped directly in front of the rival billionaire. I looked Mr. Caldwell dead in the eyes and placed the heavy folder directly on top of the merger contracts he was forcing Sienna to sign. "Before you sign that, Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority, "you might want to look at what you are actually buying." Mr. Caldwell slowly pulled his hand back from the gold pen. He was a seasoned corporate predator, who survived the ruthless world of corporate acquisitions by recognizing a deadly trap before it snapped shut. He looked thoughtfully at my sharp charcoal suit, and then down at the thick black leather folder I had deliberately placed over the signature line. Sienna immediately leaped out of her chair, her face flushed with absolute outrage. "Nora, remove your garbage from this table right now," she shrieked, reaching out to snatch the folder away. "Mr. Caldwell, please do not listen to a single word she says. She is a disgruntled former data analyst who was fired last week for gross incompetence. She is just trying to cause a pathetic scene because she is completely broke and jealous of our success." Mr. Caldwell held up a single thick hand, silencing my sister instantly. He did not survive 3 decades on Wall Street by ignoring massive red flags right before closing a deal. "What exactly am I buying, Miss Montgomery?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, keeping his sharp eyes locked entirely on mine. I reached out and smoothly flipped open the heavy leather cover. I bypassed the dense preliminary pages and turned directly to the notarized asset transfer logs. I pushed the open document toward the billionaire, making sure the official state seals were clearly visible. "You are buying a hollow shell," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and echoing clearly across the silent boardroom. 5 years ago, my father, Richard Montgomery, quietly restructured this entire corporate empire. He methodically transferred every single valuable asset out of Montgomery Holdings and placed it securely into an impenetrable private trust registered in the state of Delaware. Terrence let out a sharp, nervous breath. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his confident facade cracking completely. "That is a complete lie. We have the corporate deeds in our vault. We have the patent registrations on file. You have the licensing agreements, Terrence." I corrected him without even turning my head to look at him. "You have been so incredibly focused on draining the operational cash accounts into your offshore cryptocurrency wallets that you never bothered to check the foundational bedrock of the company. Look at the documents, Mr. Caldwell. Montgomery Holdings does not actually own a single piece of intellectual property. It does not own the predictive modeling software I built. It does not own the corporate trademark. It does not even own the dirt beneath this glass skyscraper." Mr. Caldwell pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket and leaned forward, intensely scanning the notarized pages. The boardroom was so suffocatingly quiet, I could hear the expensive clock ticking on the wall. The other board members sat frozen in their chairs, completely paralyzed by the unfolding disaster. For the past 5 years, I continued pacing slowly down the length of the long mahogany table. Montgomery Holdings has been paying a massive monthly licensing fee to the Delaware Trust just to legally operate. My father handed you a company that was entirely dependent on a rental agreement, Terrence. He gave you the temporary illusion of power while keeping the actual wealth locked far away from your greedy hands. Sienna shook her head frantically, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling wildly out of place. "This is completely ridiculous," she laughed, her voice high and choked with rising panic. "Even if this fake trust exists, my husband and I are the chief executives. We own the operational company." I stopped pacing and finally turned to face my sister directly. "You own the office desks, Sienna," I said, delivering the final, devastating blow. "You own the ergonomic chairs, the water coolers, and the massive, crippling federal debt that your husband secretly created. But my trust owns the patents, the software, and the very building we are standing in. And as the sole trustee and singular beneficiary of the Nora Montgomery Private Trust, I am making an executive decision right here, today." I looked back at the billionaire, who was now staring at the legal documents in pure horror. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, I am officially terminating the Montgomery Holdings licensing agreement," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable finality. "The company you are trying to buy no longer has the legal right to use its own name or sell its own software. You are about to absorb $20 million in bank debt for a corporation that literally cannot conduct business tomorrow." Terrence physically staggered backward, bumping hard against the thick glass wall of the boardroom. The terrifying realization of his complete failure washed over his ashen face. He was not just broke, He was entirely exposed to the federal government with absolutely no corporate shield to hide behind. Mr. Caldwell did not say another word. He took off his reading glasses and folded them neatly into his breast pocket. He picked up the incredibly lucrative purchase contract that Sienna had been milliseconds away from signing. With one smooth, violent motion, he ripped the thick stack of papers completely in half. He tossed the shredded contracts carelessly into the center of the mahogany table, like meaningless trash. "This deal is completely dead," Mr. Caldwell announced, his voice cold and unforgiving. He stood up from his leather chair, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked straight out of the executive boardroom without looking back. Mr. Caldwell left a suffocating silence. Sienna stood frozen, staring at the shredded pieces of the purchase contract. Her escape plan evaporated. She grasped the magnitude of the disaster. She spun around to face Terrence. "Terrence, do something," she pleaded. "Call him back. Tell him she is lying. Fix this right now." Terrence did not move. He was staring at me in terror. The chief financial officer was paralyzed. He realized I had outsmarted him. He knew the trust was real, and his fake empire was dead. I did not give them a single moment to recover. I walked to the media console. I pulled my father's smartphone from my tote bag. I grabbed the display cable and plugged it directly into the bottom port. The massive smart projector mounted on the far wall of the boardroom instantly flickered to life, brightly mirroring my phone screen for the entire board of directors to clearly see. "What on earth are you doing with that?" Sienna shrieked, stepping forward aggressively. "Turn that off right now. Security is on the way, Nora. You are going to federal prison for corporate sabotage." I did not even bother to look at her. I simply tapped the glowing screen, opening the highly secure audio file I had secretly recorded at the rundown motel yesterday afternoon. I reached for the boardroom volume dial and turned it up to maximum capacity. The crisp, high-definition audio of Terrence's furious voice suddenly boomed through the expensive surround sound speakers, echoing violently off the thick glass walls. "I will not go to a federal penitentiary because of some defective data analyst like you," Terrence's recorded voice snarled. The senior board members gasped audibly, collectively, sitting up incredibly straight in their leather chairs. Sienna froze completely in her tracks, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure shock, as she instantly recognized the angry voice of her own husband. Then came the absolute, undeniable confession. I watched Terrence physically shrink as his darkest corporate secrets were broadcast loudly to the entire executive room. "You think Sienna has any idea what is actually happening?" His voice sneered condescendingly through the speakers. "She is a blind, pathetic fool. She only cares about the expensive charity galas and her designer clothes. I set up the untraceable shell companies in the Cayman Islands myself. I personally funneled $20 million into offshore cryptocurrency accounts, and I deliberately used her digital executive signature on every single financial authorization form. When federal investigators finally show up with warrants, they are going to arrest her, not me." She happily signed her own criminal confession. Sienna let go of Terrence's arm, as if his expensive suit had suddenly caught fire. She stumbled backward awkwardly, bumping hard against the leather chair. The rosy color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and hollow, like an absolute ghost. She turned her head very slowly, looking at the exact man she had blindly defended against our own mother yesterday. The man she had trusted with her entire life and her entire fortune. "Terrence, you deliberately framed me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringing silence, cracking with absolute devastation. "You stole the corporate money and you actively framed me for massive federal fraud." Terrence opened his mouth to formulate yet another incredibly desperate lie, but absolutely no words came out. He looked frantically at the furious faces of the senior board members who were already pulling out their smartphones to dial the authorities. He was completely cornered and entirely trapped. But the recording was not quite finished. I let the audio play until the final devastating piece of evidence was revealed. The highly distinct sound of Terrence's heavy manic breathing quickly filled the entire room, followed closely by his ultimate cowardly exit strategy. "I am not going down for this massive mess," his recorded voice continued dripping with desperate malice. "I have my international passport. I have the untraceable cash in my duffel bag. My private flight to the Bahamas leaves in exactly 2 hours. Let Sienna take the absolute fall for the missing millions. I will be sitting safely on a tropical beach before she even realizes the corporate bank accounts are completely empty." The audio file finally clicked off, leaving a deafening and suffocating silence in the executive boardroom. Sienna stood trembling violently, her tear-filled eyes locked entirely onto the distinct, rectangular outline of the international passport pressing against the inside breast pocket of Terrence's tailored suit jacket. He did not just frame her for a massive federal crime. He was actively planning to abandon her to face a decade in federal prison completely alone. He had booked his secret escape flight for exactly 2 hours from now. And he had only bought one single ticket. The heavy silence in the boardroom stretched until it finally snapped under the weight of Sienna's breaking reality. She stared at the man she had married, the man she had blindly elevated to the highest executive ranks of our family company. Her entire life was built on a foundation of absolute privilege and superiority. She had always been the golden child, the flawless daughter, who could do absolutely no wrong. But in a matter of minutes, I had completely dismantled her false kingdom, and Terrence had delivered the fatal blow. Sienna realized her entire existence was a carefully constructed lie. Her husband had never loved her. He had only seen her as a highly convenient corporate shield, an arrogant puppet he could easily manipulate. She thought back to yesterday afternoon, when she had aggressively kicked our mother out of their luxury mansion simply to protect Terrence's fragile feelings. Now she knew our mother was completely broke and homeless because of him. But worse than the financial ruin and the destroyed family ties was the terrifying legal reality rapidly closing in around her throat. She had signed every single fraudulent offshore transfer document. She had signed the fake internal acquisition contracts just yesterday morning while lounging by her indoor pool. Terrence had meticulously set the paper trail to point directly at her. He was leaving for a tropical beach with millions in untraceable cash, and she was going to a maximum security federal penitentiary to serve his entire sentence. A low, guttural sound ripped from Sienna's throat. It was not the polished, theatrical cry she usually used to manipulate our parents to get exactly what she wanted. It was a raw, animalistic sound of pure, unfiltered rage and absolute panic. "You cowardly parasite!" she screamed, her voice echoing violently against the thick glass walls of the executive boardroom. Sienna lunged across the physical space separating them, her manicured hands extended like sharp claws. She grabbed the lapels of Terrence's expensive custom suit, completely tearing the fine fabric as she frantically reached for the inside breast pocket holding his international passport. She was not going to let him escape. She dug her long nails deeply into his chest, screaming hysterically that he had ruined her entire life and that she would kill him before letting him leave her to take the brutal federal fall. Terrence lost the very last shred of his composed corporate disguise. The charming, charismatic chief financial officer vanished completely, replaced by a desperate cornered animal willing to do absolutely whatever it took to survive. He did not try to calm his wife down or explain himself. He did not offer a single word of apology. He simply raised his large hands and violently shoved Sienna backward with maximum brutal force. Sienna stumbled hard, her expensive designer heels snapping loudly under her uneven weight. She crashed backward into the heavy mahogany boardroom table, her shoulders slamming painfully against the polished wood, before she collapsed completely onto the floor in a tangled heap of red silk. The senior board members shouted in absolute outrage, jumping from their comfortable leather chairs to intervene, but Terrence did not care about corporate optics anymore. The truth was, out his fraud was entirely exposed, and his only priority was catching the private flight leaving in less than 2 hours. "Get out of my way!" he roared, pushing violently past Chairman Davis and sprinting directly toward the heavy oak double doors. He burst out of the executive boardroom and bolted down the plush carpeted hallway. His heavy, frantic footsteps echoed loudly through the quiet penthouse suite. The executive receptionist screamed in terror and ducked behind her large mahogany desk as Terrence charged past her, knocking over a heavy marble display pedestal in his blind panic. He reached the main executive elevator bank, breathing heavily, his suit torn and his expensive silk tie hanging loosely around his sweaty neck. He aggressively slammed his hand against the down button, hitting it over and over again in a frantic, desperate rhythm. He kept glancing nervously over his shoulder, expecting boardroom security to tackle him to the ground at any second. But I had not called building security. I had made a much more important phone call yesterday evening right after I unlocked my father's phone and accessed the Geneva server. "Come on, open the doors," Terrence muttered, his eyes wild with absolute desperation. "Just open the doors and get me out of here." The digital floor indicator above the elevator chimed a sharp, high-pitched note signaling its arrival at the penthouse level. Terrence let out a loud, dramatic gasp of relief, shifting his heavy duffel bag of stolen cash higher onto his broad shoulder. He stepped forward, preparing to rush inside the moment the polished steel doors parted. The heavy doors smoothly slid open, but the elevator car was not empty, and it was absolutely not taking him down to the lobby. Standing shoulder to shoulder inside the elevator car were four heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI boldly printed across their chests. They had their hands resting securely on their weapons, and their cold, calculating eyes were locked dead onto Terrence. The lead federal agent stepped forward, blocking the exit, completely preventing any chance of escape. Terrence skidded to a violent halt, his expensive leather shoes sliding across the plush carpet. He stared at the four federal agents blocking his escape route, his chest heaving with exertion and sheer panic. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern expression and sharp gray eyes, stepped smoothly out of the elevator car. He reached into his windbreaker and pulled out a gold badge, flashing it directly in Terrence's face. "Terrence, you are under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and fleeing the jurisdiction," the agent announced, his voice echoing loudly down the quiet hallway. "Place your hands on top of your head and turn around immediately." Terrence dropped his heavy canvas duffel bag. The bag hit the floor with a loud thud, the zipper splitting open to reveal thick stacks of $100 bills spilling onto the carpet. It was the absolute worst possible evidence he could have dropped. He slowly raised his trembling hands, lacing his fingers behind his head. 24 hours ago, while Terrence was busy threatening my life in a rundown motel room, I had been busy executing the final phase of my father's plan. I had taken the entire decrypted cache of offshore banking records, the Cayman Island Shell Company ledgers, and the precise cryptocurrency tracking logs from the Geneva server and securely transmitted them directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I did not just send them anonymous tips, I sent them a complete verified roadmap of a multi-million-dollar corporate crime. They had been silently building their warrants all night, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Two agents moved swiftly forward, grabbing Terrence by the arms. They violently spun him around and slammed him hard against the thick glass wall of the executive corridor. The heavy impact rattled the glass. Terrence gasped in pain as they forced his arms down, pulling them roughly behind his back. The cold, sharp click of metal handcuffs, snapping securely shut around his wrists, echoed sharply. The arrogant, invincible chief financial officer was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, broken man. He pressed his face against the cold glass, struggling weakly against the iron grip of the federal agents. "I need a lawyer," Terrence sobbed, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "You cannot do this. I am a prominent corporate executive. I demand my phone. I need to call my legal team right now." The lead agent ignored his frantic pleas. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent recited calmly, reading him his Miranda rights while patting him down and confiscating his international passport. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." while two agents marched a crying Terrence toward the freight elevators. The lead agent and a female agent bypassed him completely and walked purposefully through the heavy oak double doors into the executive boardroom. The room was in absolute chaos. The senior board members were standing around the mahogany table, looking completely bewildered. Sienna was still sitting on the floor where Terrence had violently shoved her, surrounded by the shredded pieces of the ruined purchase contract. When she saw the federal agents enter, she let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. "Thank God you are here," Sienna cried out, pointing a shaking finger toward the hallway. "My husband just assaulted me. He stole millions of dollars from our company. He framed me for the entire thing. You have to go after him before he catches his flight to the Bahamas." The female agent walked directly toward Sienna, her expression completely unreadable. "We already have him in custody," the agent said, pulling a pair of metal handcuffs from her tactical belt. "But we are not just here for your husband." Sienna frowned, wiping a tear from her cheek. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine confusion. "I am the victim here. You are the chief executive officer of Montgomery Holdings," the agent replied, her tone strictly professional. "We have confiscated your digital servers and 4 physical contracts signed in wet ink by you yesterday morning, authorizing the illegal transfer of $7 million into an offshore shell company. Sienna, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit federal money laundering." Sienna gasped, her eyes widening in pure, absolute terror as the female agent reached down and firmly grabbed her wrist. "No, wait, you do not understand," Sienna shrieked, struggling to pull her arm away. "I did not read those documents. Terrence told me it was just standard compliance paperwork. I did not know what I was signing." The agent effortlessly twisted Sienna's arms behind her back and clamped the cold steel cuffs securely around her wrists. "Ignorance of the law is not a valid legal defense," the agent stated, pulling Sienna roughly to her feet. "You have the right to remain silent." Sienna was sobbing hysterically now, her expensive red designer dress wrinkled and torn. The reality of her massive arrogance had finally caught up with her. She looked wildly around the boardroom, searching for anyone to save her. The senior board members actively looked away, refusing to make eye contact with a federal criminal. Finally, her terrified eyes locked directly onto me. I stood perfectly still in my sharp charcoal suit, holding the heavy black leather folder that proved I owned the entire empire. "Nora, please," Sienna begged, her voice cracking with raw, desperate panic. "You know I am innocent. You know Terrence manipulated me. Please use the trust money to hire me a lawyer. Please do not let them take me to prison, Nora. I am your sister. Help me." I looked down at my older sister, the woman who had spent her entire 38 years of life, perched on a golden pedestal, was now kneeling on the boardroom carpet with her hands shackled securely behind her back. Her expensive designer mascara ran in dark, thick streaks down her pale cheeks, dropping onto her ruined silk dress. The board members, the federal agents, and the executive assistants all watched in absolute silence, waiting for my response. They expected the soft, submissive younger sister to finally cave to the emotional manipulation. They expected me to rescue the golden child, just like my parents had always done whenever she made a catastrophic mistake. They expected me to open the newly discovered trust fund and throw away millions of dollars to protect the sacred Montgomery family name from public disgrace. But that version of Nora was completely dead and buried. I stepped slightly closer to her, my sharp charcoal trousers brushing against the torn fabric of her red dress. "You are not innocent, Sienna," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady pitch that carried effortlessly across the massive, silent room. "You were never innocent. You might not have known the exact routing numbers for the offshore cryptocurrency accounts, but you were absolutely complicit in every single piece of cruelty that funded your glamorous lifestyle." "But Terrence lied to me." She sobbed frantically, shaking her head, her blonde hair falling in a tangled mess across her face. "He told me the company was doing great. He told me you were just jealous and crazy. I did not know the bank was foreclosing on your condo, Nora. I swear on my life. I crouched down slightly, bringing my eyes level with hers. Even if I believed that pathetic lie, it does not change who you actually are, I replied coldly. You sat in Mr. Harrison's law office and laughed directly in my face when you thought our father had left me nothing but a broken piece of garbage. You called me the defective child. You watched your husband terminate my employment and strip me of my livelihood right in front of you, and you smiled. You watched Terrence take my home and throw me on the street, Sienna. You cheered. I am just letting you experience the real world. Sienna squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling over her lashes and dripping onto the carpet. We are family, she whimpered weakly, her voice trembling with a pathetic desperation. You cannot just abandon your own flesh and blood to the federal government. Mom needs us. Dad would never want this to happen to his own daughter. I let out a harsh, dry laugh that made the senior board members physically flinch. Do not dare invoke his name. I snapped my icy composure, finally flashing with raw, unadulterated heat. Dad is the exact person who set this entire trap. He knew exactly what Terrence was doing, and he knew exactly how arrogant and lazy you were. He gave you the rope, and you eagerly tied the noose around your own neck because you were too obsessed with your country club image to actually read the complex financial documents you were signing. You played chief executive officer for the flashing cameras while you let a parasite sink the ship. I stood back up, straightening my designer blazer. I looked at the female federal agent holding Sienna's arm and gave her a brief, authoritative nod. The agent firmly pulled my sister up to her feet, ignoring her dramatic cries of pain. Nora. Please, Sienna screamed as the terrifying reality of her departure finally set in. I will give you absolutely everything. I will sign the operational company over to you right now. Just pay the massive bail money. Please do not let them put me in a concrete cell. I own the foundation, Sienna. I said, my voice completely devoid of any lingering pity. I already own the proprietary algorithms, the technology patents, and the building we are standing inside. I do not need your hollow bankrupt shell of a corporation. And I will absolutely not spend a single penny of my private trust to buy your freedom. A real world has brutal consequences, and yours have finally arrived. The federal agents began marching her toward the heavy oak double doors. Sienna fought violently against their unyielding grip, her broken designer heels dragging awkwardly across the plush carpet. Her desperate, frantic pleas rapidly devolved into vicious, hateful insults. She screamed that I was a jealous monster, that I had planned this from the very beginning to steal her perfect life and destroy her marriage. I did not offer her a single word in response. I simply picked up my heavy black leather folder, turned my back, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving my sister in tears as the federal agents hauled her away. I did not look back as the boardroom doors closed behind me, securing Sienna's fate. Exactly 1 week later, the entire landscape of my life had completely transformed. The scandalous arrest of the Montgomery Holdings chief executives dominated the national financial news cycle for days. Terrence and Sienna were both formally denied bail, considered massive flight risks by the presiding federal judge. With the operational company completely paralyzed by the federal investigation and its assets frozen, I smoothly activated the legal protocols of the Nora Montgomery Private Trust. I assumed full absolute control of the intellectual property and the corporate real estate, preparing to rebuild a brand new legitimate enterprise from the ashes of their unprecedented greed. I was sitting outside an exclusive high-end coffee shop located just across the street from my glass skyscraper, enjoying the crisp morning air and reviewing the new architectural plans for the corporate lobby. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, relishing the quiet peace of my new reality. But that hard-earned peace was abruptly shattered by a desperate, frantic voice calling my name across the patio. I looked up from my digital tablet to see my mother Caroline rushing across the busy sidewalk. She was practically unrecognizable. The pristine white cashmere coats, the flawless makeup, and the oversized dark designer sunglasses were completely gone. She wore a wrinkled beige raincoat, and her usually immaculate blonde hair was frizzy and unkempt. She looked incredibly fragile and aged, stripped entirely of the arrogant superiority that had defined her existence. She pulled out the metal chair across from me and collapsed into it, breathing heavily. "Nora, thank God I finally found you," she gasped, her hands shaking violently as she reached across the small cafe table, trying to grab my hand. "I have been calling your old phone number for 3 days straight. You have to help me, Nora. The bank just served me with official eviction papers this morning. They are seizing the entire estate." I smoothly pulled my hand back, placing it securely in my lap. I looked at her with the exact same analytical detachment I used to assess corporate risk. "Terrence liquidated your retirement fund, Mom," I said plainly. "The federal government has seized all of his offshore assets, including the Cayman Island shell companies holding your money. You are completely bankrupt. Of course, the bank is taking the house, but you have the trust." Caroline pleaded, her eyes wide and panicked as she leaned closer. "I saw the news reports, Nora. You control the entire foundation of the company. You have millions of dollars in liquid capital. You can easily pay off the estate mortgage and reinstate my monthly allowance. You have to let me move into a luxury penthouse with you. We are blood, Nora. Family sticks together." The absolute audacity of her statement hung heavily in the air between us. I stared at the woman who had spent 34 years treating me like an unwanted burden. "Family sticks together," I repeated slowly, testing the bitter taste of the hollow words. "Is that what family does, Mom?" Because I distinctly remember a very different version of this family. Where was this fierce family loyalty last week, when I was sitting in Mr. Harrison's law office? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "When Terrence fired me and told me he had secretly mortgaged my condo, you did not say a single word to defend me. You looked at your diamond rings and told me not to make a scene. When I was thrown out into the freezing rain to live in a rundown motel, you completely ignored me until you needed $5,000 to pay for a superficial country club luncheon. You happily watched them strip me of my livelihood and my home just so you could keep your platinum credit card." Caroline began to sob loudly, covering her face with her shaking hands. "I made a massive mistake, Nora. I trusted the wrong daughter. I am so incredibly sorry. Please, you cannot let your own mother end up on the streets. It would be a massive public humiliation for the Montgomery family name. Even now, facing total ruin, she only cared about the public image. She was not sorry for how she treated me. She was only sorry she had backed the losing horse." I picked up my tablet and my coffee cup, preparing to leave. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a tri-folded glossy brochure I had specifically printed out that morning, anticipating this exact, inevitable encounter. I dropped the brochure directly onto the cafe table right in front of her tear-stained face. "This is a state-funded low-income senior living facility located on the outskirts of the city," I said coldly. "They accept residents who have zero financial assets. I took the liberty of filling out the preliminary application for you. You should probably call them today before the waiting list gets too long." Caroline stared at the cheap brochure in absolute horror, her mouth hanging open. "You cannot do this to me," she whispered, her voice cracking with pure devastation. "I am your mother, and I am the defective child," I replied smoothly. "Good luck, Mom." I turned my back on her and walked across the street toward my towering glass skyscraper, leaving her completely alone to face the harsh reality she had actively helped create. I walked back into the grand marble lobby of my building, feeling a profound sense of closure. The old era of the Montgomery family was officially dead, and the final corporate funeral was already underway. Over the next few weeks, the hollow shell of Montgomery Holdings completely unraveled on the public stage. Financial news networks covered the spectacular collapse daily, analyzing how a $65 million empire could disintegrate overnight. Without the legal rights to use my proprietary algorithms or the corporate trademarks, the company had absolutely zero revenue streams. They could not legally sell a single piece of software or secure a single client contract. The primary corporate lenders who had so aggressively demanded their $20 million quickly realized they were holding a completely empty bag. Terrence had stolen all the liquid cash, and my private trust held all the actual value. The federal receivers stepped in and formally filed for Chapter 7 corporate bankruptcy. The prestigious company my sister had ruined was unceremoniously dragged onto the public auction block. The banks were absolutely furious, but they had no legal recourse against my Delaware trust. The trust was an entirely separate legal entity, fully protected by impenetrable state privacy laws. The banks were forced to absorb the massive $20 million loss, writing it off as a catastrophic bad debt, while the federal government continued hunting down Terrence's offshore cryptocurrency accounts. When the bankruptcy auction finally took place, I attended in person. I walked into the crowded downtown courthouse wearing my sharp charcoal designer suit, holding my heavy black leather folder. The room was filled with bargain-hunting corporate liquidators, hoping to buy cheap office furniture and discounted computer servers. But I was not there to buy used chairs. I was there to legally reclaim my physical kingdom for pennies on the dollar. Acting as the sole trustee, I used a tiny fraction of the vast liquid capital held within the Nora Montgomery Private Trust to sweep the entire auction. I purchased every single remaining operational asset from the bankrupt shell of Montgomery Holdings. I bought the executive desks, the high-end server racks, the physical employee contracts, and the entire technical infrastructure. Because the company was drowning in massive debt and possessed zero intellectual property, I acquired the entire physical framework of the corporation for an absolute fraction of its original perceived value. The corporate liquidators in the auction room simply could not compete with my strategic leverage. With the physical assets legally secured, I returned to my glass skyscraper and initiated the ultimate corporate merger. I officially combined the newly purchased operational infrastructure with the untouchable intellectual property locked safely inside my Delaware trust. I sat at my desk and signed the massive stack of legal paperwork with a heavy gold pen. I drafted a brand new corporate charter and filed it with the state, completely erasing the tainted Montgomery Holdings name from the business registry forever. In its place, I created a brand new entity, Montgomery Trust Analytics. I stood on the bustling downtown sidewalk a few days later, watching a massive construction crane carefully lower the old gold-plated corporate logo from the top of the glass skyscraper. In its place, they hoisted a sleek modern silver sign displaying the new company name. It was a massive public declaration of my total victory. The company was no longer built on my father's toxic manipulation or my sister's fragile ego. It was built entirely on my own analytical brilliance and my unyielding resilience. I rode the private executive elevator up to the penthouse suite. The boardroom where Sienna had desperately tried to sell my inheritance was completely transformed. I had the heavy mahogany table removed and replaced it with a modern collaborative workspace. I did not want a throne room. I wanted a highly functional command center. I spent my first official week as the chief executive officer restructuring the entire workforce. I ruthlessly fired every single complacent executive who had enabled Terrence's massive fraud or turned a blind eye to his toxic behavior. I promoted the hardworking analysts and the brilliant software engineers who had always been forced to hide in the shadows just like I had. I doubled their salaries and gave them actual equity in the new company, ensuring their absolute loyalty and dedication to our shared vision. I walked into my new spacious corner office and stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The financial markets had already responded incredibly well to the corporate restructuring. Montgomery Trust Analytics was completely debt-free, heavily capitalized, and highly profitable from its very first day of operation. I was no longer the dismissed younger sister or the invisible data analyst. I was the sole owner, the visionary, and the absolute undisputed titan of a billion-dollar empire. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air had turned into a bitter, freezing winter. I took a morning away from my corner office and walked through the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. I took a quiet seat in the very back row of the gallery, sitting perfectly still in my charcoal designer suit. The courtroom was packed with financial journalists and curious spectators eager to witness the final chapter of the Montgomery family scandal. Terrence sat heavily at the defense table. The impeccably tailored chief financial officer was completely gone. He wore a loose-fitting, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound with heavy metal chains that clinked loudly every time he shifted his weight. His hair was cropped close to his scalp, and his skin had a sickly, pale gray tone. He looked like a hollow, defeated shell of a man. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corporate predators, looked down at him from her high bench with absolute disgust. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She listed his extensive crimes, reading off the massive wire fraud, the offshore embezzlement, and the cowardly attempt to flee the jurisdiction with millions in stolen cash. Then she delivered the final devastating blow. She sentenced Terrence to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. Terrence did not shout or argue. He did not even look back at the crowded gallery. He simply lowered his head, staring blankly at the scuffed wooden floor, as the armed federal marshals grabbed his chained arms and dragged him through the heavy side door to begin his new miserable life in a concrete cage. Sienna sat at a different table across the room, completely separated from the husband she had thrown entirely under the bus. She had spent the last 6 months fighting desperately to avoid a prison cell. To save her own skin, she had taken a brutal plea deal, turning state witness and providing the federal prosecutors with every single detail of Terrence's manipulation. Her absolute betrayal kept her out of an orange jumpsuit, but it did not save her life. Sienna looked incredibly frail. She wore a cheap, plain gray dress that fit her poorly. Her signature blonde hair was dull and pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. The judge turned her sharp, uncompromising gaze toward my sister. She acknowledged Sienna's cooperation, but she made it abundantly clear that ignorance and extreme arrogance were not valid excuses for facilitating a multi-million-dollar federal crime. The judge ordered Sienna to pay over $7 million in direct financial restitution to the defrauded creditors. Because Montgomery Holdings was completely bankrupt, the restitution fell entirely on Sienna's personal estate. The judge formally ordered the immediate seizure of the sprawling Hamptons mansion, the entire fleet of luxury cars, and every single piece of designer jewelry Sienna had ever flaunted. Her personal bank accounts were completely drained by the federal government. She was declared legally and absolutely bankrupt. Sienna wept silently at the defense table, her thin shoulders shaking violently as the heavy wooden gavel slammed down, finalizing her total financial ruin. She was legally free to walk out of the courtroom, but she had absolutely nowhere to go. The court officially adjourned, and the crowded gallery began to empty into the grand marble hallway. I stood up and walked slowly toward the heavy glass exit doors, watching my sister walking a few paces ahead of me. She moved like an invisible ghost, completely ignored by the financial journalists who had once praised her as a brilliant corporate visionary. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps of the courthouse. The sky above Chicago had bruised into a dark, angry purple, and a torrential, freezing downpour was washing heavily over the busy city streets. Sienna stopped at the edge of the concrete overhang. She had no thick cashmere coat and no black umbrella to shield her from the biting wind. There was no sleek black limousine idling at the curb, waiting to whisk her away to a warm, safe mansion. She hugged her thin, bare arms tightly across her chest, shivering uncontrollably as the freezing rain began to blow sideways, soaking the cheap, thin fabric of her gray dress. I stood completely dry under the deep shelter of the courthouse archway, watching her. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or regret. She looked exactly the way I had looked 6 months ago, standing in the corporate parking lot. She had been completely stripped of her career, her luxurious home, her transportation, and her family. She was entirely broken and completely alone, standing in the freezing rain, holding absolutely nothing. I turned up the collar of my designer coat and stepped into the waiting town car, leaving my sister behind in the freezing downpour. I did not look out the rear window as the driver pulled away from the courthouse. The past was finally closed and the future was entirely mine to build. 2 years have passed since that rainy afternoon. I am currently sitting behind a massive, sleek mahogany desk in the corner penthouse office of Montgomery Trust Analytics. The view from my floor-to-ceiling windows stretches across the entire Chicago skyline, a sprawling network of glass and steel that I now navigate with absolute authority. My office does not look anything like the ostentatious executive suites Terrence and Sienna used to decorate. There are no useless marble pedestals or flashy gold accents. Everything in this room serves a distinct purpose, reflecting the sharp, calculated efficiency of a data risk analyst who knows exactly how fragile an empire can be. I do not just sit back and passively collect corporate dividends from my inherited intellectual property. I actively run the company every single day. Montgomery Trust Analytics has evolved into the premier corporate auditing and digital security firm in the country. My entire business model is built directly on the painful lessons my family taught me. We specialize in aggressive forensic data analysis, hunting down internal financial anomalies and hidden corporate liabilities before they can destroy a business. I personally handle the most sensitive cases. Just this morning, I concluded a massive internal investigation for a prominent female founder in Silicon Valley, whose male board members were secretly conspiring to dilute her equity and force her out of her own tech startup. Using the exact same analytical methodologies I used to dismantle Terrence's offshore shell companies, my team tracked the illegal back-channel communications and the hidden financial transfers of her corrupt board. We handed her a fully encrypted dossier of undeniable leverage. She fired the entire board before lunch and secured her absolute control over the company she built. Helping vulnerable business owners protect their lifework from greedy corporate parasites has become my greatest professional satisfaction. I am the shield they need and the sword they never saw coming. I employ over 300 of the brightest analytical minds in the industry. I pay them exceptionally well and demand absolute transparency. There are no golden children in my corporate structure. There is no toxic nepotism or blind favoritism. You earn your position through undeniable competence and unwavering integrity. I walk through the glass corridors of my firm, and my employees do not lower their heads in fear or whisper behind my back. They look me in the eye with genuine respect because they know I built this sanctuary from the ground up by surviving the ultimate corporate betrayal. Sometimes my team provides me with brief updates regarding my former family. Sienna is currently working as a low-level retail associate at a suburban department store, struggling to pay her massive court-ordered financial restitution on a minimum wage salary. My mother Caroline lives in the exact state-funded senior facility I recommended, complaining bitterly to the nursing staff about how her wealthy, ungrateful daughter abandoned her. I do not feel a single ounce of guilt when I hear these reports. I only feel absolute clarity. They are exactly where their own actions place them. I close the encrypted client file on my laptop and lean back in my ergonomic leather chair. My eyes drift across the polished surface of my mahogany desk, stopping on a highly specific object, resting perfectly centered near the edge. It is not an expensive modern art piece or a crystal corporate award. It is a small, scuffed black smartphone. The device is completely dead, the battery permanently drained long ago. But I did not throw it away. I had it professionally mounted inside a custom-built bulletproof glass display case, resting on a solid brushed steel base. The screen is forever dark, reflecting the ambient light of my corner office. Visitors and high-level corporate clients frequently ask me about it, assuming it is the very first piece of technology I ever coded, or a sentimental prototype from the early days of the company. I never correct them. I just smile politely and tell them it is a critical piece of my foundational history. They have absolutely no idea what that small piece of glass and metal truly represents. It is a permanent daily reminder of my father, Richard Montgomery, and his incredibly brilliant but terrifyingly ruthless final lesson. He knew that inherited wealth often creates weak, arrogant fools. He knew that giving me a safe, comfortable executive position would only make me a soft target for manipulative predators. My father did not want to leave behind a vulnerable heiress. He wanted to forge a corporate titan capable of defending his legacy in the darkest and most treacherous waters of the business world. He deliberately handed me a ticking time bomb and forced me to either learn how to defuse it or die in the blast. I did not die in that blast. I stood directly at the absolute epicenter and let the intense shockwave shatter every single illusion I had ever held about love, loyalty, and familial obligation. Growing up in the suffocating exclusive bubble of the American elite, I was heavily programmed to believe that family was an unbreakable bond. I was taught that wealth was a birthright measured entirely in designer labels, exclusive country club memberships, and sprawling zip codes. My father, however, knew that version of wealth was nothing but a fragile temporary illusion. He knew that true power in modern America is not defined by the expensive car you drive or the extravagant charity galas you throw to impress your superficial friends. True power is absolute leverage. It is the invisible intellectual property, the complex lines of proprietary code, and the ironclad legal trusts that dictate who actually controls the concrete foundation of the business. Terence and Sienna desperately wanted the shiny gold crown, but they were completely oblivious to the castle rapidly crumbling beneath their own feet. For 34 years, I willingly allowed myself to be defined by their cruel and dismissive narrative. I was the designated family scapegoat. I was the highly convenient punching bag they regularly used to elevate their own massive insecurities. I foolishly thought that endurance was a noble virtue. I genuinely believed that if I just worked hard enough, kept my head down, and quietly proved my intellectual value to the company, they would eventually make a space for me at their table. But toxic families do not reward loyalty or hard work. They only exploit it. The more you endure their abuse, the more they demand your absolute submission. When my father died, he did not just casually cut me out of the corporate will. He violently kicked the chair out from under me. He deliberately stripped away my corporate identity, my shelter, and my lifelong familial safety net, forcing me into a state of absolute terrifying isolation. Isolation is a brutal and unforgiving teacher, but it is also the ultimate forge for the human spirit. When you are sitting completely alone in a freezing rundown roadside motel room with exactly $0 to your name and the rain beating against the thin glass window, you finally realize that nobody is coming to save you. You have to save yourself. My father did not hand me $1 billion empire on a silver platter, because he knew I would have likely just handed it over to Sienna and Terence simply to keep the fragile family peace. I was too conditioned to yield to their demands. He had to make me hate them enough to fight back. He had to push me directly into the blazing fire so I could completely burn away the soft, submissive daughter and forge my own impenetrable armor. He gave me the raw, unrefined ore, but I had to be the one to swing the heavy hammer. I had to choose to become the titan he always knew I could be. Now I look out over this sprawling city and I see the business world through a completely different analytical lens. I see hidden vulnerabilities and deep structural weaknesses in every skyscraper. I see exactly how easily a massive legacy can be systematically dismantled by blind arrogance and unchecked greed. But more importantly, I see the incredible unyielding strength that comes from absolute self-reliance. I am no longer tied to the Montgomery name as a toxic symbol of old money privilege or massive corporate fraud. I have entirely redefined it. I have built a formidable fortress of data analytics and corporate security that actively protects the brilliant innovators and ruthlessly punishes the corporate parasites. My massive success is not simply a tool for petty revenge. My success is the natural, undeniable byproduct of finally realizing my own absolute worth and refusing to ever discount it again. If you have ever been the person standing in the background watching someone else take credit for your hard work, or if you have ever been told that you do not belong at the main table, you need to understand one fundamental truth. Your inherent value is not determined by their catastrophic inability to see it. You do not need to beg for a seat at their toxic table. You have the absolute power to build your own table. You have the skills, the resilience, and the sharp intellect to walk away from the people who only keep you around to make themselves feel taller. You do not have to wait for a locked smartphone from beyond the grave or a sudden massive betrayal to finally force your hand. You can make the conscious choice to stop playing their rigged game today. I look one last time at the dark, unblinking screen of my father's old smartphone resting quietly inside its secure glass display case. I reach out and trace the smooth, polished edge of my mahogany desk, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of the massive empire I rightfully claimed. I am not the defective child. I am not the corporate scapegoat. I am the sole architect of my own extraordinary destiny. They took everything from me thinking it would break me. They didn't realize that when you strip a woman of everything she has to lose, you give her the ultimate power to win. The game is over, and I took the board. Nora's journey from a discarded family scapegoat to a self-made corporate titan reveals a profound and painful truth about surviving toxic environments. We are frequently conditioned by society to believe that family loyalty is an absolute unbreakable obligation, even when that loyalty actively requires us to sacrifice our own dignity. The core lesson to take away from this story is that your inherent worth is never defined by the people who are deeply committed to misunderstanding you. Nora spent years quietly enduring disrespect trying to earn her place at a family table where the rules were permanently rigged against her. Her toxic mother and greedy sister consistently used her as a convenient baseline to elevate their own fragile egos. It was only when Nora was violently stripped of her entire safety net that she discovered her true leverage. She realized that endless endurance in the face of emotional abuse is not a virtue. The ultimate victory is not about seeking petty revenge or desperately trying to prove your abusers wrong. The real victory is achieving absolute self-reliance. When you finally stop seeking validation from a family system that was specifically designed to keep you small, you instantly unlock the power to build your own reality. Nora used her sharp intellect and her unbreakable boundaries to forge an impenetrable armor, transforming her darkest isolation into her ultimate strength. Many of us stay in damaging relationships because the fear of walking away feels much worse than the daily pain of disrespect. But stepping into the unknown can be the exact forge you need to discover who you truly are without the suffocating weight of their expectations. If you have been shrinking yourself just to fit into spaces that refuse to see your value, I urge you to walk away and start building your own table today.